I know that Marx famously said that our task is to change the world and that philosophers have only striven to understand it, but I have to say, when I look at Marx's works, he spends an enormous amount of time trying to understand the world, and that is crucial to changing it. And it's crucial for one very, very simple reason. And I think that reason is best expressed in the term that Marx used, which is fetishism. By fetishism, Marx is referring to the masks that disguise what is really going on. And he once said about his own notion of science that if everything was as it appeared to be on the surface, there would be no need for science. And Marx really wants to get beneath the surface. And I think the reason why it is important for anybody who's doing an analysis of contemporary capitalism to really think about this question of fetishism is because if we only respond to the surface appearances of things and we don't understand what is going on underneath, then what happens is that we make really false judgments in terms of what we might do about a situation. In other words, in classic medical practice terms, we respond to the symptoms rather than to the underlying causes. And I think what Marx was always about, and I think what we should be about, is looking at the underlying causes of much of the misery that exists in the world, the alienation that exists in the world, the inability of capitalism to meet basic wants and needs for the mass of the world's population, the inability of capitalism to deal with serious environmental issues and issues of that kind. So the concept of fetishism is crucial. And to me, I think part of the mission is to get behind the surface appearances so that we really and truly see what is going on. And I think the place where we might want to do this most seriously right now is to look at the credit system. The credit system is constituted by a whole series of masks so that you cannot really see what is going on. And as a result of that, we are assured by the bankers and we're assured by everybody who's engaged in the credit system that this is something that is being set up for the public good and for public benefit, and that we all should benefit from it. But what happened after 2008 was the veil was partially lifted off a whole series of corners of the credit system. And what we saw inside of the credit system was a great deal of thievery, theft, and actually obnoxious practices, which needed to be addressed. And so, to me, what we need to do is to strip bare the essence of what the credit system is about, and then use that understanding of what the essence of the credit system is all about in order to think through strategies of transformation of the credit system, or even ask the question, why do we need a credit system anyway? And why can't we actually construct alternative ways of providing use values to people that do not rely upon this elaborate and very sophisticated system of credit creation, which you immediately notice has made some people extremely rich. And behind that, of course, also there exists something else, which is the false promises, which are often bandied around within the history of capitalism. I mean, I'm old enough to remember sort of 50 years ago being told that the solutions to global poverty were going to be through unleashing the powers of capitalist development, unleashing the skills and capacities of the entrepreneurs, of having capitalist systems of development and capitalist systems of property rights, and a whole kind of set of institutions like international credit institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and all the rest of it. And we were told again and again and again that this was the main way in which international poverty was going to be addressed. With this idea in mind that actually there are key issues that need to be addressed, and an alternative vision of the kind of society we might want to construct that can lead us into a critical engagement with what is going on right now. And to me, we should always approach critical engagement and thinking about political action with the idea that there is some alternative to the kind of society we now live in, and that alternative doesn't have to be specified in sort of explicit utopian terms, but it is important always to have a dream of something different, something possible, and my dream is constituted by the idea that everybody should have their basic needs met. They should have access to the use values that provide them with a decent living environment and decent capacities to live their lives in the way they want. We should be free of social relations of domination. We should have transparent and open social relations with each other. We should come to a way of operating in the natural world, which is as beneficial to nature as it is to us, and that we should have some vision of that kind of society. And that is, if you like, the utopian vision, which sort of animates me when I'm thinking about engaging in a critical analysis of the sort that I'm really trying to engage in here. I always want to use occasions like this to try and think about something a little bit different. So I'm going to try a few ideas and see what happens.
Bien, él les da las gracias por estar aquí y dice que quiere aprovechar este tipo de oportunidades para intentar pensar en nuevas ideas y en nuevas oportunidades.
One of the things that strikes me as very strange
Una de las cosas que me sorprende, es algo raro,
is that we've gone through a crisis, but no new thinking has come out.
es que hemos atravesado una crisis y ningún pensamiento nuevo ha resultado de eso.
Now, the 1930s produced Keynesianism and a lot of ideas about the state.
La crisis de los años 30 produjo el keynesianismo y un montón de ideas sobre el Estado.
The 1970s produced monetarism and, again, a lot of different ideas about the state.
La crisis de los años 70 trajo la idea del monetarismo y un montón de nuevas ideas sobre el Estado.
But this time, it seems the only thing that everybody can do is to try to interpret what is happening either in Keynesian or monetarist terms.
Pero luego de esta crisis que acabamos de atravesar, pareciera que solamente podemos pensar en términos de keynesianismo o de monetarismo.
So half of the world, like China and the rest of it, is behaving in a kind of Keynesian way, and the other half, like Europe and North America, are behaving in a monetarist way.
Entonces, la mitad del mundo, China, ¿verdad? China, están pensando, y ese sector del mundo están pensando en términos keynesianos, mientras Europa y el resto ese costado del mundo está pensando en términos monetaristas.
Now, this situation in the realm of thought is nothing new.
Esta situación no es nada nueva.
I have this wonderful quote from Marx from way back, and it reads as like this. And I will read the whole thing, and then you can do the translation. In the crises of the world market, the contradictions and antagonisms of bourgeois production are strikingly revealed. Instead of investigating the nature of the conflicting elements which erupt in the catastrophe, the apologists content themselves with denying the catastrophe itself and insisting, in the face of their regular and periodic recurrence, that if production were carried on according to the textbooks, crises would never occur.
Bien, cita a Marx y dice, en las crisis del mercado mundial, las contradicciones y antagonismos de la producción burguesa son sorprendentemente reveladas. En vez de investigar la naturaleza de los elementos en conflicto que irrumpen en una catástrofe, los apologistas se contentan en negar la catástrofe en sí misma e insistir de cara a su recurrencia regular y periódica, que si la producción fuera llevada a cabo de acuerdo a los libros, las crisis nunca ocurrirían.
Now, there is, I think, another problem with the way in which we understand capitalism.
Hay otro problema en el modo en que entendemos el capitalismo.
If we go to the economics textbooks, you'll have a wonderful description of how markets work, efficiency, you know, the whole panoply of mathematical models to explain how capitalism works.
Si uno recurre a los libros de economía, allí encuentra modelos perfectos sobre cómo funciona el capitalismo, ¿no? Y los modelos de eficiencia y ese tipo de cosas.
And policymakers turn to these models to say, well, we should have austerity or we should have stimulus.
Los políticos entonces, o quienes regulan las políticas, recurren a estos libros para decidir cómo debería regularse tal o cual cosa.
And this is a fantastic case, from my standpoint, of creating an abstract model and then making reality conform.
Okay. Esto es lo que a él le resulta maravilloso, y es crear un modelo abstracto y luego intentar que la realidad se adapte a ese modelo.
But there's another story about capitalism that you never see in the textbooks.
Pero hay otra historia del capitalismo que nunca se ve en los libros.
And we can best see that today by what has been happening on Wall Street.
Y lo podemos ver a través de lo que ha sucedido en Wall Street.
Where actually you see a system of legalized robbery.
Donde vemos literalmente un sistema de robo legalizado.
Of a huge process of what I call accumulation by dispossession.
En un gran proceso que él ve como, can you repeat that?
Accumulation by dispossession.
Acumulación por desposesión.
And when you go and read the biographies or the autobiographies of the bankers,
cuando uno va a leer las biografías o autobiografías de los banqueros,
you see they take absolutely no notice of any of those textbooks.
Uno se da cuenta de que no han tomado ninguna nota, de que no han seguido para nada aquellos manuales de economía a los que refería antes.
And you see, for instance, the main hedge fund managers in the midst of this crisis made $3 billion each.
Y uno ve que los managers, ¿no?, de estos fondos buitres hacen o han ganado a través de estos procesos $3 billones.
Now the textbooks don't talk about that.
Y los libros no hablan de eso.
And it seems to me that that story has to be integrated somehow or other into our account.
Y me parece que esa historia tiene que ser integrada a este relato, ¿no? Tiene que ser tenida en cuenta.
And we have to ask ourselves the question, why does a capitalist society tolerate that kind of behavior?
Entonces nos tenemos que hacer la pregunta de por qué la sociedad capitalista tolera ese tipo de comportamiento.
Why is it that capitalism cannot survive without that kind of behavior?
¿Por qué el capitalismo no puede sobrevivir sin ese tipo de comportamiento?
And I've been trying to come to a way of understanding this through studying Marx.
He llegado o he intentado llegar a comprender esto a través de estudiar a Marx.
And in the 3 volumes of Capital, Marx does the following.
En los 3 volúmenes del Capital, Marx hace lo siguiente.
In the first 2 volumes, he tends to follow the classical political economists.
En los 2 primeros volúmenes, él intenta seguir a los economistas políticos clásicos.
But in the 3rd volume, he starts to take up the whole kind of question of merchant capital, finance capital, and landlord capital.
Bien, pero en el tercer volumen, él toma el caso de el capital mercantil, el capital financiero y el terrateniente.
Yes. And one of the characters he comes across
uno de los caracteres con el que él se cruza
is a man called Emile Pereire.
Es un hombre llamado Émile Pereire,
who was a banker in the Second Empire, Paris.
Que era un banquero en el Segundo Imperio de París.
And the Pereire brothers were extremely important in the financial dealings of the 1850s, 1860s in France.
Los hermanos Pereire fueron muy importantes en los acuerdos financieros en Francia en los años 1850 y 1860.
Now, Marx says of them that they had the intriguing character of swindler and prophet.
Marx dice de ellos que tenían esta extraña combinación de ser estafadores o timadores y profetas.
And this then poses the problem of how to interpret characters like that in the history of capitalism.
Esto nos lleva a la pregunta de cómo interpretar este tipo de personajes en la historia del capitalismo.
Now, one of the things I should do is give a little background about them.
Lo que yo tendría que hacer es darles un poco de información sobre ellos.
They were very, very active in a utopian movement of the 1830s and the 1840s, which was modeled after the thinking of Saint-Simon.
Bien, ellos fueron muy importantes en el desarrollo del pensamiento utópico de los años, can you repeat the years?
1830s, 1840s.
1830s y 40s, siguiendo el pensamiento de Saint-Simon.
Now, Saint-Simon had many very interesting ideas.
Saint-Simon tenía varias ideas muy interesantes.
For instance, he was one of the first people to actually propose something like the European Union.
Él fue el primero en proponer algo como la Unión Europea.
He was opposed to the violence of the French Revolution.
Él estaba en contra del resultado, the violence,
The violence.
¿Cómo?
Violencia.
Violencia, perdón, ahí understand.
Yeah.
De la violencia, él estaba en contra de la violencia de la Revolución Francesa.
So he looked for a peaceful transition to a more equitable society.
Él buscaba o esperaba una transición más pacífica hacia una sociedad más igualitaria.
And one of his big ideas was that you should create associated capital.
Una de sus ideas principales era que había que crear capital asociado.
That is, you should take all those little bits of money and bring them together into a conglomeration of financial power that could do great works.
Había que tomar entonces aquellos pequeños dineros y conglomerarlos juntos de modo de conformar una potencia económica.
So for example, in the 1840s, there was a serious discussion about putting a canal through Nicaragua to link the Atlantic to the Pacific, and similarly in Suez.
Durante los años 40 entonces hubo una gran discusión acerca de establecer un canal en Nicaragua y la misma discusión sobre el canal de Suez.
Now, the point he made was individual capitalists could not do this kind of work.
El punto que él quería subrayar era que los capitalistas individuales no podían hacer este tipo de trabajo.
And that therefore you had to create new institutions which would assemble capital to build railways, build, ports, build infrastructures, and all the like.
Bien, por lo tanto tenían que existir instituciones que combinaran distintos capitales para poder llevar a cabo este tipo de grandes infraestructuras como puentes, este tipo de cosas.
Now, after the revolution of 1848, there were big problems in Paris.
Después de la revolución de 1848, hubo grandes problemas en París. Perdón, estoy un poco... Just a thing. Yo no soy traductora.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Y estoy un poco nerviosa.
You're doing great. Don't worry. You're doing better than I can. So.
No, estoy bien, gracias.
Now, when after the revolution, Louis Bonaparte came to power and called himself an emperor in 1852.
Luego de la revolución, cuando Luis Bonaparte toma el poder y se convierte en
1852.
En 1852 y se convierte en emperador.
He wanted to follow the Saint-Simonian path.
Él quería seguir el camino dictado o marcado por Saint-Simon.
And so the Pereire brothers became crucial to Louis Bonaparte's project.
Entonces los hermanos Pereire se convirtieron en una figura crucial para el plan de Louis Bonaparte.
And one of those projects was, of course, to rebuild Paris.
Uno de esos proyectos fue reconstruir París.
And that's what Haussmann and the Pereire brothers did.
Y eso es lo que hicieron Haussmann y los hermanos Perer.
But they needed new financial institutions.
Pero necesitaban instituciones financieras nuevas.
So they set up credit institutions.
Entonces establecieron instituciones de crédito.
And in the process they found a really neat way of becoming very rich.
En ese proceso encontraron un camino muy directo para hacerse muy ricos.
Which was not exactly what Saint-Simon had in mind.
Que no era exactamente la idea que Saint-Simon tenía en la cabeza.
It was very simple. You offered a 3% to people to put the money in your bank, and then you lent out at 7%.
Uno le ofrecía a la gente 3% para poner dinero en su banco, pero el 7% para retirar el dinero del banco.
So 4% belonged to you.
Exacto, así, de modo que el 4% quedaba en la institución de crédito.
So they built these credit institutions in a very, very fierce way.
De modo que construyeron estas instituciones de crédito de una manera feroz.
And it was through these means that when you go to Paris now, you'll see the rebuilt city of that period.
Y a través de estos medios uno puede ver ahora, cuando visita París, la zona reconstruida a través de este sistema.
At the same time, you also had capital and labor fully employed.
A la vez, había capital y mano de obra completamente empleada.
So you got out of the crisis of 1848 and you rebuilt the city, and capital was doing very well and they were becoming very rich.
De modo que salieron de la crisis de 1848 con la ciudad reconstruida, con empleo de pleno y todos felices, todos ricos. ¿No?
Now, the trouble is, however, that credit institutions use credit money.
El problema crucial es que las instituciones de crédito utilizan dinero de crédito.
And credit money is just paper.
Y el dinero de crédito es solamente papel.
It has no intrinsic value.
No tiene valor intrínseco.
And credit money, therefore, is very different from commodity money.
Y por lo tanto, el dinero en papel es muy diferente al dinero de las commodities, es decir, de los bienes.
And commodity money, gold and silver in particular,
los dineros de commodities, particularmente la plata y el oro,
is very solid.
Son muy sólidos.
And if you go back and look at how these commodity monies were made central, you will find them very well explained in the work of John Locke.
En John Locke uno encuentra muy bien el desarrollo de cómo estas commodities, estos metales, se convirtieron en depositarios de valor, ¿no? en dinero.
Yeah, and John Locke insisted that true money is gold and silver.
Y John Locke insistía en que el verdadero dinero es la plata y el oro.
And it's not, you're not saying that money is natural.
Él no está diciendo que el dinero sea natural.
But you're using the natural properties of gold and silver to anchor what is going on in the monetary system.
Pero sí está usando las propiedades naturales de la plata y del oro para anclar lo que sucede en el sistema.
And without that, of course, you can just create credit monies all over the place.
Sin eso se podrían crear dineros de crédito por todos lados.
So you have two kinds of money, credit money and gold.
Por lo tanto hay dos tipos de dinero, el dinero de crédito y el oro.
And in the Second Empire, there was another banker, Rothschild, who controlled the gold.
En el Segundo Imperio había otro banquero, Rothschild, que controlaba el oro.
And there's a huge conflict between Rothschild and the Pereira brothers.
Y hay un gran conflicto había un gran conflicto entre los hermanos Pereira y Rothschild.
And that conflict was over who had the gold and who had the paper.
Ese conflicto consistía en quién tenía el oro y quién tenía el papel.
And in 1867,
en 1857,
the paper market crashed.
El mercado del dinero de papel quebró.
And Rothschild brought it down.
Y Rothschild fue el que lo llevó a la quiebra.
Because they didn't have the gold to back the paper.
Porque no tenían el oro para respaldar el papel.
Now, if you want a good account of this, you go read Zola's novel Money.
Si uno quiere enterarse mejor de esto, hay que leer El dinero de Zola.
Because there is this huge fight over financing.
Porque en esa novela hay una enorme pelea sobre el financiamiento.
But notice something.
Pero hay que notar algo.
Rothschild won.
Rothschild ganó.
But the Perez rebuilt Paris.
Pero los Perez reconstruyeron París.
In other words,
en otras palabras,
Perez were the activists and the dreamers and the producers.
Los Perez fueron los activistas y los soñadores y los productores.
And Rothschild didn't really do that much in helping to rebuild Paris.
Y Rothschild de hecho no hizo tanto en ayudar a reconstruir París.
So this conflict is something which has gone on historically ever since.
Este conflicto es algo que se ha desarrollado históricamente desde ese momento.
And what Marx does in Volume 3 of Capital is to build an understanding of how this system works.
Y lo que hace Marx en el tercer tomo del Capital es tratar de construir un pensamiento que explique cómo funciona este sistema.
You have to visualize it in the following way.
Hay que visualizarlo de este modo.
The very base of the system is value, which is constituted by social labor.
La base de la sociedad está constituida en el valor que es de hecho el trabajo, la fuerza de trabajo, ¿no?
It is the labor which is socially necessary to produce and reproduce society.
Es el trabajo lo que es realmente absolutamente necesario para producir y reproducir la sociedad.
But value is a social relation.
El valor es una relación social.
And therefore it is what, as Marx calls it, it's objective but immaterial.
Por lo tanto, Marx la describe como objetiva pero no material, inmaterial.
It therefore needs a material representation.
Por lo tanto, necesita una representación material.
So value gets represented in gold and silver.
De modo que el valor se representa en oro y plata.
But there is always a gap between the value and what is and the form of representation.
Pero hay siempre una brecha entre el valor y su forma de representación.
Representations misrepresent in certain ways.
Las representaciones representan mal de algunos modos.
It's like maps.
Es como los mapas.
On the one hand, they're useful, but on the other hand, they misrepresent.
De algún modo, en un modo son útiles, pero de otro modo representan mal el referente.
I always like when I'm traveling on an airline, you have the map, you know, and you see the plane is about this big, and you realize you could walk the length of Newfoundland by just simply walking the length of the plane.
Dice que cuando vuela en avión y ve la pantalla en la que aparece el mapa y el avión desplazándose, la escala de ese mapa le hace pensar que podría ir caminando de una punta a la otra del mundo.
So there is therefore a problem of the representation.
Hay por lo tanto un problema de representación.
But leave that aside for the moment.
Pero dejémoslo de lado por un momento.
The base is value. The second layer is gold and silver, commodity monies.
La base es valor y la primera fase o el primer nivel son las commodities de oro y plata.
But gold and silver are very bad for everyday commerce.
Pero el oro y la plata son muy malos para el comercio cotidiano.
I mean, if I had to pay for my coffee today in gold, it would have been very difficult.
Sería muy difícil tener que pagar mi café con oro.
I would have a tiny little bit of gold like that, and somebody would go, and disappear.
Tendría un poquito así de oro y alguien lo soplaría y desaparecería.
So you end up with representations of the representation.
Por lo tanto, terminamos usando representaciones de las representaciones.
That is, you end up with paper monies and coins.
Es decir, estamos con dinero, con billetes y monedas.
Now somebody has to control the paper monies and coins.
Alguien tiene que controlar los billetes y las monedas.
And that is typically the role of the central bank.
Y ese es típicamente el rol de los bancos centrales.
And the central bank, therefore, has a very pivotal role in this whole system.
Y el Banco Central tiene un rol de pivot en este sistema.
But just having paper monies is not good enough.
Pero solamente tener dineros, o sea, billetes, no es suficiente.
Because a lot of commerce doesn't necessarily have all of the paper monies around that they need.
Porque un montón de tipos de comercio no tienen suficiente dinero en papel como para poder efectuarse.
So we write IOUs.
Por lo tanto escribimos te debos, pagarés.
And what this means is you create credit monies.
Es decir, creamos dinero de crédito.
So Marx says there's a series of pivots. You have value, you have commodity monies, you have the central bank, and you have credit monies.
Entonces Marx dice, tenemos el valor por debajo, el oro y la plata, los bancos centrales
and credit monies.
Y el dinero de crédito.
And you then ask the question, what is the relationship between each one of these layers in the monetary system?
Entonces luego se pregunta cuál es la relación entre cada uno de estos elementos en el sistema monetario.
Marx has a very interesting way of putting this. He says each layer is autonomous and independent, but subsumed under the lower layer.
Entonces Marx explica que cada una de estas capas es autónoma e independiente, pero todas están subsumidas a la base, al valor.
Now, if you find that a difficult concept, then I'll give you an analogy.
Si lo ven difícil, les voy a hacer una analogía.
It's like raising teenagers.
Es como criar adolescentes.
They all claim they're autonomous and independent.
Todos dicen ser autónomos e independientes.
But when they get in trouble, they're subsumed back.
Pero cuando se meten en problemas, se subsumen a la casa.
So actually, when you look at the populations who occupy these different layers,
entonces cuando uno ve el distinto tipo de población que ocupa estas capas,
it's like a whole layer of different teenagers on top of each other.
Es como una capa de adolescentes una arriba de la otra.
With the most irresponsible and crazy teenagers at the top.
Donde los adolescentes más locos e irresponsables están arriba de todo.
These are the masters of the universe on Wall Street.
Estos son los maestros, los amos del universo de Wall Street.
And it is very hard to discipline them.
Y es muy difícil disciplinarlos.
Why is it so hard to discipline them?
¿Por qué es tan difícil disciplinarlos?
Because it is absolutely essential that they be autonomous and independent from those beneath them.
Porque es esencial que se mantengan autónomos e independientes de las capas que están por debajo de ellos.
So that is the structure that Marx sets up to understand the relationships within the financial monetary system.
Entonces esta es la estructura que Marx encuentra para explicar el sistema financiero.
Now,
monetario.
there's something else that also goes on here.
Y hay algo más que sucede acá.
Because when I said that there is a gap between what is being represented and the representation,
porque cuando él dijo que hay una brecha entre la representación y lo que está siendo representado,
when you look at that, you come across another aspect of Marx's theory that is terribly important.
Uno se cruza con otro de los aspectos cruciales de la teoría de Marx,
which is the idea of fetishism.
Que es la idea del fetichismo.
And fetishism is about the masking of real relations.
Y el fetichismo es acerca de enmascarar las relaciones reales, ¿no?
And actually what Marx does when he talks about this whole system is to see it as layered with fetishisms.
Entonces, lo que Marx hace al explicar esta estructura es hablar de capas de fetichismos, ¿no?
Yeah. And when you get to the top,
y cuando uno llega arriba de todo,
it's absolutely impossible for anybody sitting up there to see what the relationship is to the base.
Cuando uno está desde arriba de todo e intenta ver cuáles son las relaciones verdaderas que existen en esta estructura, uno ya no puede.
And this produces another category which is very important for Marx.
Y esto sí, de esto resulta otra categoría muy importante en Marx,
which is the category of fictitious capital.
Que es la categoría de capital ficticio.
And fictitious capital is essentially produced and reproduced in the credit system.
Y el capital ficticio es constantemente producido y reproducido en el sistema de crédito.
Good. And then this raises, if you like, the whole kind of question of what is the relationship between the fictions and the realities of value production.
De esto surgen una cantidad enorme de preguntas sobre cuál es la representación y el valor real.
So, and Marx has a wonderful way of talking about the fact that the last person in the world you should ask about what is going on in the banking system is a banker.
Marx dice entonces que si uno realmente quiere saber qué está pasando en el mundo financiero, a la última persona que habría que preguntarle es a un banquero.
Because by definition they are dealing with fictions.
Porque por definición están tratando con ficciones.
And they must deal with fictions.
Y tienen que lidiar con ficciones.
They don't have any choice.
No tienen otra opción.
So they represent the world in terms of their fictions.
De modo que representan el mundo en términos de ficciones.
Now, what was so interesting about the banking crisis recently,
Lo que fue muy interesante sobre la crisis bancaria reciente,
that we were always being told the banking system is so complicated that the only people who can actually work out what to do are the bankers.
fue que la situación bancaria era tan difícil de explicar que los únicos que podían hacerlo eran los banqueros. Se nos dijo, claro.
And this is interesting because what Marx shows is that they are the last people you should ask.
Y esto es interesante porque Marx señala que estas son las personas a las que menos habría que preguntarle sobre esto.
Now, this whole structure is, of course, connected very strongly to the way in which wealth is extracted.
Esta estructura está conectada muy fuertemente al modo en que la riqueza, en que se obtiene la riqueza.
That vast amounts of wealth can be extracted from the credit system.
De que enormes cantidades de riqueza pueden ser extraídas del sistema de crédito.
But that has to come from somewhere.
Pero eso tiene que salir de algún lado.
And Marx's point is it comes from social labor.
Y el punto que señala Marx es que viene del trabajo social.
And if there is not enough social labor,
Y si no hay suficiente trabajo,
then at some point or other the credit system will crack.
de algún modo el sistema de crédito se va a romper, va a quebrar.
So this structure, it seems to me, does something which conventional economics textbooks don't do.
Esta estructura hace algo que los manuales de economía no dicen o no hacen,
Which is to explain how it is that we get into the financial and commercial crises that we have seen occurring historically.
que es explicar cómo entramos en las crisis financieras que hemos atravesado, que hemos experimentado recientemente.
Yeah. There is, however, one other piece to this that has to be put there.
De todos modos hay otra pieza, hay una pieza faltante en esto.
That is, if the credit system is characterized by what Marx calls the height of insanity,
Sí, el sistema de crédito está caracterizado por esta...
height of insanity, so
ok,
loco,
por este pico
totalmente
de locura,
loco.
por este pico de locura, okay, height of insanity, okay.
And he uses language like that. He says, you know,
Usa este tipo de lenguaje
He
para
says-
referirse a eso.
he says the credit system is the mother of all insane forms.
El sistema de crédito es la madre de todas las formas de locura,
But he then does something very interesting,
pero luego hace algo muy interesante,
which is he takes that insanity in two directions.
toma esta demencia en dos direcciones.
The first is to say, well, perhaps there is a possibility here for a transition to socialism.
Bueno, quizás una podría ser, bueno, quizás desde aquí hay una transición posible hacia el socialismo.
Why?
¿Por qué?
Because, and this goes back to Saint-Simon,
Porque esto nos retrotrae a San Simón,
because you see within the credit system the association of capitals in its purest, most massive form.
porque en el capitalismo vemos estas asociaciones de capitales en sus formas más genuinas.
And that therefore,
Y por lo tanto,
if we understand it right,
si lo entendemos bien,
we could actually seize hold of all of that and turn it back.
podríamos como frenar todo eso y volver atrás, no, frenar el momento de la crisis y volver atrás, volver al punto atrás.
For a social purpose.
Con un propósito social.
And he actually talks about the Saint-Simonian ideas of, in a way, going back to Saint-Simon and saying the Saint-Simonian basis of this gives us a set of possibilities.
Entonces vuelve a San Simón, y si vuelve a las ideas de San Simón y lo ve desde esa perspectiva, entiende que ahí hay un montón de posibilidades en la asociación de capitales.
The second thing he does is to say, why is it that capitalism in general tolerates these insane forms?
La otra cosa que propone o que se pregunta es por qué la sociedad capitalista tolera estas formas insanas, estas formas dementes.
And there's a very simple answer to that,
Y hay una respuesta muy sencilla para eso,
which he lays out in the following way.
que explica de este modo.
Capitalists begin the day with a certain amount of money.
Un capitalista empieza el día con una cantidad determinada de dinero.
They typically go and buy labor power and means of production.
Luego lo lleva a través de la fuerza de trabajo y de los medios de producción.
They produce a new commodity
Produce un bien nuevo
and they sell it at the end of the day for more money than they started out with.
y lo vende al final del día por más dinero que aquel con el que empezó.
So they always end up with more at the end of the day than they started out with.
Por lo tanto, siempre terminan con más al final del día que como empezaron.
The big question is, where does the demand for the more come from?
La gran pregunta es, ¿de dónde viene esta demanda por más?
Because the capitalist puts into motion a certain amount of demand by paying workers the wage,
Porque el capitalismo pone en circulación, dándoles sueldos a los obreros,
who then spend it on
que luego lo
commodities,
gastan
and they also buy means of production.
y compran medios de producción.
But they don't put in enough to cover the surplus that is produced at the end of the day.
Pero no ponen suficiente para cubrir el surplus que resulta al final del día.
So there are lots of complicated ways in which it can be covered, but the simplest way to think of it is this.
Hay muchos modos de explicar esto, pero la más sencilla sería esta.
Is that there is in fact no demand at the end of the day.
Es que al fin y al cabo no hay demanda al final del día.
So what the capitalist does is to buy now and pay later.
Entonces lo que hace el capitalista es comprar ahora y pagar más tarde.
That is, the gap between the demand and the supply
Esa es la brecha entre la demanda y la oferta,
is covered by credit.
se cubre con crédito.
That is, capitalism could not survive without credit.
El capitalismo no puede sobrevivir sin crédito.
And it's very interesting
Y es muy interesante
that actually the accumulation of wealth in capitalist societies
que de hecho la acumulación de riqueza en las sociedades capitalistas
has been paralleled by an accumulation of debt.
construye un paralelo con la acumulación de deuda.
For instance, you look at the total output of goods and services historically and it goes like this.
Si uno observa el total no resultante de bienes y servicios, históricamente siempre sube.
It grows at a compound rate.
Sí, sube con un interés compuesto. Gracias.
And actually, if you look at the accumulation of national debt, just take national debt,
Y si uno mira solamente a la acumulación de las deudas nacionales,
it similarly goes like this.
también suben.
So I think it's great that the Republican Party in the United States wants to abolish the national debt.
Entonces a él le parece genial que el Partido Republicano en los Estados Unidos quiera abolir la deuda nacional, la deuda pública.
They will destroy capitalism.
Van a destruir el capitalismo.
They will do a better job of it than the working class has ever done.
Van a hacer un trabajo mucho mejor que lo que la clase obrera ha hecho jamás.
So that connection then, as to what the credit system does.
Esa conexión es lo que hace o lo que crea el sistema de crédito.
In other words, if you take that series of pivots upon which the credit system relates,
Si uno toma esa serie de niveles como pivotes,
that you shouldn't think of it as somehow or other building up from the base.
uno no debería pensarlo como algo que se construye desde la base.
You have to see it as building down from the top.
Uno necesita verlo construido desde arriba hacia abajo.
And that therefore the whole system of capitalism
Y que por lo tanto todo el sistema de capitalismo
is very much about constructing class power.
Es mucho más cercano a construir poder de clase.
And it's very interesting that you cannot have property without having money.
Es interesante que uno no pueda tener propiedad sin tener dinero.
And in fact, money becomes one of the big ways in which property is established.
Y también que el dinero es uno de los modos en los que la propiedad se establece.
And credit is one of the big ways in which money is established.
Y el crédito es una de las grandes maneras en las que el dinero se establece.
So instead of reading the history of capitalism out of those economic textbooks,
Entonces, en vez de leer la historia del capitalismo a través de estos manuales de economía,
you start to read all of these relations the other way around.
Uno empieza a leer todas estas relaciones del modo inverso.
And each one of them, however, has a class character.
Y cada una de ellas tiene una característica de clase.
For example, the question of gold and silver.
Por ejemplo, la cuestión del oro y la plata.
Gold and silver were held by John Locke to be absolutely essential to the establishment of property rights.
El oro y la plata eran, según John Locke, esenciales para construir
property rights.
Los derechos de propiedad.
And there was a very simple reason for that, because property rights depend upon continuity beyond current use.
Bien. Y esto tenía que ver con que los derechos de propiedad tenían que ver con la continuidad más allá del uso.
If I eat an egg, it's
si
gone.
yo como un huevo, se va. En cambio, la propiedad permanece.
If I want to have a property right in eggs,
sí. Y si quiero tener valor de derechos de propiedad sobre un huevo,
eggs have to last a long time.
Exacto, los huevos tienen que durar un tiempo mayor.
So that is why Locke said gold and silver are crucial.
Por lo tanto, Locke dijo, por eso el oro y la plata son cruciales.
Because gold and silver are long lasting.
Porque el oro y la plata duran mucho tiempo.
They are not oxidizable.
No se oxidan.
And that has a crucial relationship to the establishment of property rights.
Y esto tiene un rol fundamental en el establecimiento de los valores de los derechos de propiedad.
Which in turn has a fundamental aspect in relationship to the perpetuation of class, the establishment and perpetuation of class power.
Que tiene una relación directa con la construcción y la perpetuación de el poder de clase.
So, what I'm arguing here is that we have to find a way to integrate some of these understandings about the credit system.
Lo que él está argumentando entonces hoy es que tenemos que entender integrar estos elementos para entender el sistema de crédito, ¿no?
In fact, we have to rewrite all of the economics textbooks.
De hecho, tendríamos que reescribir todos los manuales de economía.
In order to show what
para poder mostrar
the class basis is of each one of these layers.
¿Cuál es la base de clase de cada una de estas capas?
And what are the fetishisms that hide these relations?
¿Y cuáles son los fetichismos que esconden estas relaciones?
And why is it that so much of what circulates in society now is fictitious capital?
¿Y por qué tanto de lo que circula hoy en día en nuestra sociedad es capital ficticio?
And how that becomes, as it were, a major vehicle for accumulation by dispossession.
Y cómo esto se convierte en un vehículo para la acumulación por desposesión.
And this seems to me to be a way of re-understanding how a capitalist economy works.
Y este es un modo en que nosotros podemos recomprender el modo en que funciona el sistema capitalista.
Now, what I've been trying to do in my own work
Lo que él ha estado tratando de hacer en su propio trabajo
is through a rereading of Marx's Capital,
es a través de releer El Capital de Marx,
to try to integrate the various aspects of Marx's arguments across all three volumes.
para tratar de integrar los conceptos que aparecen en Marx a través de los 3 volúmenes.
And what was so interesting to me was to realize how crucially important the credit system was.
Y fue muy importante para él darse cuenta de de cuánta importancia tenía el sistema de crédito
in the functioning and stabilization of a capitalist dynamic,
en el funcionamiento y estabilización de la dinámica capitalista.
at the same time as we start to see more clearly
A la vez empezamos a ver con mayor claridad
how each one of those layers
cómo cada una de esas capas
has a critical role to play
tiene un rol crítico para jugar,
in terms of political action.
en términos de acción política.
That in order to understand
Para poder comprender
capitalism,
el capitalismo,
we need not only a much better theory of how capitalism works,
no necesitamos una teoría mejor de cómo funciona el capitalismo,
but also to have a critical aspect on how to intervene within that structure.
también necesitamos un aspecto crítico acerca de, o verlo desde un aspecto crítico acerca de cómo intervenir dentro de esa estructura.
And to think about ways in which those interventions can occur.
Y pensar en los modos en que esas intervenciones puedan ocurrir.
So I'm actually very interested in the San-Simonian roots
Estoy muy interesado en la raíz de San Simón, ¿no?
of these arguments
De sus argumentaciones,
and how they also carry over into the dreaming of something different.
y cómo ellas están llevadas o proyectadas en el sueño de construir algo distinto.
Because the fact is that the world we live in was constructed by people like the Pereiras.
Porque el hecho es que el mundo en el que nosotros vivimos fue construido por tipos como los Perer,
Not by the Rothschilds.
no por los Rothschild.
And I think that this history, therefore, as Marx points out, contains within it the possibility for radical transformations.
Entonces, mirarlo de esta manera que contiene la potencialidad de transformaciones importantes, ¿no?
Which is why I like that formulation about Pereira, that they had the interesting mix of character of swindler and prophet.
Y por eso le gusta esta descripción de los hermanos Perer como la combinación de timadores y profetas.
Because they connected their swindling to false prophecy,
Porque conectaron la estafa a las falsas profecías,
in which there's only going to be a better world somewhere down the line.
que proyectan que siempre va a haber un mundo mejor al final del camino, ¿no?
And, you know, it's a bit like Althusser's comment about the economy. In the last instance, it never comes.
Como que el último, como se suele decir en economía, can you repeat that, please? Eso, que nunca llega. Ok, gracias.
And I think that, therefore, we have to start to deal with the false prophecy, the alien consumerism, and all of those things.
Entonces tenemos que empezar a pensar esta falsa profecía
del consumismo alienante.
Exacto.
And get rid of the swindling.
Y liberarnos de los estafadores, de la estafa.
So that's next week's job.
Ese es el trabajo que tenemos para la semana que viene.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
One of the key conclusions that I come to out of this analysis is that the credit system is one of the primary means by which massive amount of accumulation by dispossession occurs. And just to give you some ideas about the dimensions of this, African American populations in the United States lost something like nearly 70% of their asset values during this whole crisis. Hispanic immigrant populations have lost similar amounts. The white population lost less, about 28%. Now this is a massive amount of losses which is visited upon most vulnerable populations. Coming out of this credit situation in which the state then bailed out the credit system, The state then pays for that by a system of austerity which actually launches another bout of accumulation by dispossession. There should, in fact, be a movement, a political movement, which is against all forms of accumulation by dispossession. I'm not personally too excited by moral arguments, but one of the reasons I like this kind of politics is it goes against the typical moral arguments that are made by the bankers and everybody else, which is that they are supposedly doing the public, are engaging in works for the public interest, when plainly what they're doing is engaging in works which are against the public interest. So a movement against accumulation by dispossession. But when you put it that way, you look around and you say, well, where else do we see accumulation by dispossession going on? Everywhere around the world we see pension rights being eroded. This is another form of accumulation by dispossession. We see indigenous rights to raw materials and natural resources being commandeered. In fact, what we see in global capitalism is not so much the classic kind of forms of exploitation of labor power. What we just see is a system of accumulation by dispossession which is making the rich richer and richer. And by focusing on accumulation by dispossession, we end up with a politics which unifies indigenous rights movements with, say, marginal population needs in advanced capitalist countries, with immigrant rights movements and so on. In fact, we have a much more common basis for a political fight against capitalism, and it can be actually articulated in moral terms, saying, why is it that capitalism cannot survive without engaging in thievery, robbery, and all of these illegal practices which we see? In other words, let's clean up capitalism and see if a decent capitalism could just exist without this whole system of robbery and thievery and accumulation by dispossession. My own conclusion, but I can be persuaded perhaps it's wrong, is that capitalism cannot do without accumulation by dispossession, and that if you eradicated all forms of accumulation by dispossession, then capitalism would essentially collapse. Now, it may be possible that that's not the case, but let's take it there and find that argument when we get there. But first, let's have a massive movement against all forms of accumulation by dispossession. Of course, in many parts of the world, we see contemporaneously self-built housing occurring, but the typical approach to self-built housing is to say that this is the inferior solution to the housing problem for marginalized populations and impoverished populations. Now, I think we should be taking a lot of the energy and skill and so on which is involved in self-built housing and trying to expand it into a very, very general system of housing provision in many cities of the world, instead of doing what we're doing right now, which is attempting to drive out the self-built sector by importing the whole kind of credit institutions and financial system. So there are opportunities in areas like this to come up with alternative forms of housing provision, housing ownership, housing security and so on, which are already there for us to build upon, and instead of treating them as inferior, we actually start to treat them as the basis of an alternative form of social construction of housing. So I think we should be actively pursuing the idea that we're going to curb the power of money as capital to circulate in society. And the way in which you do that is to start to reduce the possibilities for accumulation of capital by money being used to produce more money. If I have this kind of utopian, slightly utopian vision, it would go something like this, that we would want to construct a society in which exchange value is not the dominant form in society, but use value is the dominant form, and eventually even move towards the idea that we live in a use value society, one in which exchange value has disappeared as being relevant to the situation. So to me, innovations along these lines become absolutely critical where we try to organize the divisions of labor in society and our codependence upon each other nationally and internationally via mechanisms other than through the market and through the circulation of money and the circulation of money capital. Now that is going to involve experimentation at a very high level in alternative ways of exchanging use values directly rather than going mediated through the monetary forms. And there are other reasons, by the way, where this starts to become absolutely essential, and those reasons have to do with the fact that 3% compound growth forever cannot continue. And at some point or other we're going to have to live in a society which is not about the accumulation of wealth and power, not about the accumulation of goods and services, but which is about the accumulation of human talents and capacities and powers to do new things with with fewer and fewer resources if necessary. So for that to happen, it means that we have to also find strategies to undermine capital accumulation processes, and so I love this idea of finding a money form that oxidizes and so disappears, and which actually inhibits the accumulation of capital rather than actually enhancing it. So one of the things that's really required here is the exploration of some non-monetary system to support exchange relations, which works in a way other than barter. Because we know the inadequacies of the bartering system. We cannot, if you like, shift back or shift into bartering situations. Those bartering situations do arise in moments of crisis, of course, but then they quickly disappear after the crisis is even halfway resolved. So what we need is an alternative exchange mechanism to both barter and conventional monies, and that's going to require a way of exchanging use values in multiple ways through multiple agents who are producing and consuming, and to do it in a way which does not invoke conventional monetary systems and particularly does not permit the accumulation of wealth and power on the part of some as opposed to others. You know, some people might argue that inflation is a form of oxidation, but I would argue it is not. They're completely different. The point about inflation is, of course, that it is a general increase in prices of everything, whereas oxidation simply takes away a surplus from an individual at a particular historical point where they have not actually been participating in the production and consumption system of society, so that the loss that occurs with oxidation is individualized, it is not social, whereas inflation is a social phenomena entirely. But whichever way we go, it seems to me it's very important to try to move in a way that de-fetishizes what is going on around us. And to me, one of the most important things that we can do from an academic standpoint or an intellectual standpoint is to try to emphasize the power of fetish beliefs in our society and the power they have to demobilize people from doing things as opposed to mobilizing them. So when I talk about various layers of strategies that we might engage in politically, I would always attach to that the idea of each one of those activities of political intervention has to actually de-fetishize a situation. And I think the de-fetishization of the credit system right now is absolutely critical as the first step towards getting people to start to imagine a completely different way of delivering use values to people that allow people a decent living.